Greetings and welcome back, beloved listeners and internet trolls and haters. We're glad you're here to another edition of Redemption Meditations. I am Steve, and with me, as is our custom, is Dana and Lee. Gentlemen, how we doing?
Hey guys, doing well. How are you guys?
Salutations. Doing so good. Hope you guys are doing good.
I'm doing well. So we have more submitted questions, and that's going to be our jumping off point for this episode. We had a question we thought was interesting that would be worth spending a little time on. And I'm going to just get right into it here, fellas. I'm going to read this to you. It doesn't have a name. I have no idea who submitted it, but thank you. And if you have a question that you think would be useful, keep them coming, because we love the questions. We know we're talking about something at least one of you is interested in. So let's start with this one. Fellas, if you had the opportunity, what is something you would tell yourself in early ministry that would have helped you through difficult times, or at least better prepared you for the things to come? Dana, what do you think? If you could jump in the DeLorean and hit 88 miles an hour and go back and talk to young, bright-eyed Dana and tell him, impart some wisdom, what would you give that guy?
So there's I have a feeling this conversation would go on for a very long time. The first thing that pops in mind is hold fast to the ordinary means of grace. There was a time early in my ministry. So I've been in full-time pastoral ministry for 20 years now. This is my 20th year. And I was a youth pastor for a while and an associate pastor, which involved a lot of youth work. And then I was a solo pastor here when I first came to Logan'sville at the time for 8 years. And now we hired an additional staff, Pastor Ben. And so thinking back over it, especially in those early years, I was pretty enamored with the next big thing, whether it was the emerging church stuff that kind of breezed through for a short period of time, or the attractional model that I kind of swayed back to that, and then it was the YRR, the Young Restless Reformed, which I'm actually grateful for. I'm actually grateful for all of my experience. I learned, even though I learned negatively, I learned through all of it. And the Young Restless Reformed movement that kind of spawned the Together for the Gospel Coalition. Those were kind of the things. And then there were some big leaders in that at the time, and they were really into podcasting and blogging back then. But if I'd held fast to the ordinary means of grace, God's proclaimed word, prayer, those two in particular, as my primary task as a pastor, that would have saved me a lot of being thrown around by every wind and wave of church fad.
Yeah, that's good.
That's probably the first thing that I would say.
Lee, how about you? What do you think?
Well, this was tough. So I'm a lay elder and have been one only for a couple years, but I think going back to I've talked to people before about like the cage stage period back when I was kind of going through that Young Restless and Reformed thing that Dana was just talking about. And I think one of the things I would tell my younger self then, in preparation for becoming an elder later, would be to value time spent with people more than I did. I was in that mindset, that sort of cage stage mindset of like, I'm reformed now, so I need to like read all the books, I need to have debates. I need to convince people. And I needed I think I would go back and I would kind of push my old self around a little bit and say that none of this stuff is going to matter if you don't love them. You've got to love them. You've got to spend time with people and in obedience to Christ, love them, and value the time spent with them, and do the one another's the way that we talk about at RBC a lot. I think in those earlier times, I didn't value that as much as I should have, and I would go back and change it. So there'd be times where I would begrudgingly go to dinner with people when I could have been sitting at home alone reading some systematic theology tome, which I love to do, but I was in this frame of reading those things almost for the sake of reading them. Ideally you're reading important texts like that to know God better, to better apply God's word. I would want to go back and tell myself the reading that you're doing, the reading that you want to do, needs to be for the purpose of not only knowing God better, which is good, but also in application toward helping other people, to helping me be more outward and a better witness, not only to fellow believers, to love those called to Christ, but to be a better witness to the lost as well. I needed to, instead of just acquiring knowledge, which I did for a time, I needed to have more of an eye on applying that and actually doing something with it. I was slow on the uptake on that, and I would want to encourage my older self to get with the program a little sooner than I did. And I'm obviously still not perfect in that, but God really grew my love for people by leaps and bounds once I finally did come to that realization. And I would like to go back and see that a little sooner than I did.
That's really interesting, because mine is actually kind of the opposite of that, like my experience at least. And so I think some of it is full-time ministry versus lay ministry. I think that's a big part of this, right? So, but and also the nature of, like, I did a lot of youth ministry early on, and so I spent a lot of time with kids and youth leaders, right? Which were we were in a college town, so a lot of them were college students, and so I spent more time probably with people than studying. And I think there's reasons for that. And if I was going to go back, like, one of the things I was thinking is to answer this question was, I would have spent more time studying, not less time with people, but just more time studying, and maybe less time messing around, just wasting time with one thing or another. Right. Scrolling, there wasn't scrolling back when I started, but like, that type of thing, reading pointless blogs or whatever. But I spent a lot of
blog?
Time with, what is a blog? A web log. So I spent a lot of time with students early on, and some of that was because when I was a student at university, the church that we were members of. So I was going to school full time, and I was older. I was in my early 30s. And so I wasn't involved in anything on campus. I went to school, and then we had two little kids. My college experience was completely different than most, 18 to 22-year-olds. And so we had kids. I wasn't involved in anything on campus. I didn't care about any of that. I just went to school and went home. And at home, I got involved in the church, and the children's director of the church. So I went on to become the youth pastor there. But before even I did that, I volunteered to help out with an after school program with 4th, 5th, and 6th graders, I think, in the community. And he and I would get these kids together along with a couple of high school kids from church, and we would play games with them. And we actually had a whole program. I don't even remember all of it, but we played a lot of Foursquare. And that type of thing, and developed that into some discipleship. But I spent a lot of time with these kids, and that was very valuable. And that so translated into when I started at the church full time, I kind of took that model, which was 2 afternoons a week, like Tuesdays and Thursdays for a couple hours each. And I multiplied it. And so I had a bunch of kids that I was meeting with like that, 4 or 5 young guys that we would get together. We'd play a game. We'd have, a snack of some kind, and usually read the Bible or something together. We were doing some discipleship. But I didn't spend a lot of time studying theology, and looking back on it, and I would even say my college education, my undergrad, gave me some basics, but I don't think my undergrad degree is got me to where I needed to be a pastor. It wasn't even designed to do that. It was actually an associate pastor degree, so to be a support guy and not a preacher, not an exegete. And I did do some of those classes, but that was what it was designed to be. And so in order to learn the theology, to be able to preach full time here at this church, I've had to kind of put my nose to the books, whatever the term is. I've had to kind of come in and really study. And so it probably takes me longer to prepare a sermon than it does, somebody that's got advanced degrees. I'm not sure, but everybody's different. But I put more time in now trying to figure out. So for example, I know I'm kind of talking here and not giving you guys a chance, but for example, right now I'm preaching through Revelation. And before that, so we did, what was right before Revelation? Was it First Corinthians? No, what was
Thessalonians?
The Thessalonians, both Thessalonians, right? But then before that was Leviticus, and so Leviticus. So all of those 4 books, Leviticus, First, Second Thessalonians, and Revelation, are incredibly complicated, and to try and figure out how to preach them when you got to repeat the phrase "long lobe of the liver," like that's kind of become our joke, right? In Leviticus, we have to repeat that over and over and over again. I've had to spend a lot of time figuring out both the law, so in Leviticus, and then eschatology in Thessalonians and Revelation. So I've had to put a lot of work into that, and like even recently I've been thinking I need to get out of the office more. I spend time with people. I've had lunch with people this week and met for coffee, but I need to get out of here more. But I also have a responsibility to proclaim and to do it accurately. So it's just going to take me a little bit longer to study.
And it's all a balancing act. I think that's why kind of the opposite experiences that you and I have talked about just in these first few minutes show the balancing act of this whole thing is, being face to face with people, one-on-one, talking, the overused and terrible phrase, doing life together part. I'm about to get kicked off this
like podcast. You're in prison. You're going to do life together.
We're doing life. Yeah. 20 to life.
20 to life together.
And then the really important work of studying to show yourself approved, studying to make sure that what you are, whether you're teaching Sunday school, preaching week in and week out, leading a small group on a Wednesday night or a Thursday night, whatever the thing might be, to make sure that you are checking not only your life, but your doctrine as well.
Yeah.
And we only have so much time. we all have the same number of hours. What do we do with them is another question. And so that I think the balancing act is important, and I think it's a tough tightrope to walk, and nobody walks it perfectly.
Well, so to go back and kind of answer the question, I rambled for a little while about it, but to answer that question, what was something I would tell my younger self or whatever? I think spend how do I put it? Spend a dedicated amount of time studying theology, like reading theology, but make it like like 2 hours in the morning or something like that. Like I'm going to read this book this year. This year I've got a checklist on my phone of I'm going to read these books this year. And I want to know what it is at the end of the year that I accomplished these things. And I wish that I had done that 20 years ago and started to grow in my theology, because that's how you grow in it. And then, there's a famous preacher who has fallen in ministry, but very recently wrote a repentance letter. Okay. He used to say, and I don't always agree with this, but he would say, give your mornings to the Lord, give your afternoons to man or people, and give your evenings to your family. Now in ministry, it doesn't always work that way. There's evening stuff. I mean, guys can't meet you in the afternoon if they have a job, typically, right? Yeah. You're doing visitation in the evenings. I'm not meeting with women, right? So like my wife and I are going to have to go and do visitation or have people into our home or something like that. That's going to be evening work. But that sort of regimented do this, that actually is quite helpful for someone like me. It might not be helpful for everyone. But for me to think in those categories, mornings I do this, afternoons I do this, evenings I do this, actually could be really helpful. And I wish that I had applied. I'm trying to apply some of those things now. I wish that I had applied those things 20 years ago.
Yeah, that's good. It's interesting that you guys you each mentioned some things that are basically on I made a couple notes here on.
Oh, Steve, I forgot you were here.
Yeah. I made a couple notes on things I would tell my younger self, and you guys each mentioned something that's very similar to what I had here. Dana, you were just talking about being more formal and how you keep your time, you know.
Yeah.
And one of the things I had on my list was being more regimented in my prayer life, and maybe what I needed to do was even have like a notebook or a journal or something that's going to sort of force me to make a daily entry in the like I think of it in terms of like going to the gym and writing down what you did. The writing it down doesn't actually do anything other than it might help you stay on track.
Right.
And I can't help but wonder if my prayer life would come more naturally and easier today if I had just been really almost regimented about, no, I'm going to keep a journal or notebook. I'm going to write down every day. And then if I blow it, I'm going to have to look and see, oh man, I haven't done this the way I should. And I'm going to have, those kinds of things. Right. I think that would have been helpful for me if I had just kind of forced myself to do that in order to try to establish a habit that we should keep. Mm-hmm. And then the other one that I had here that Lee kind of touched on was the cage stage factor, where I wasn't really doing ministry, although probably in my mind I was on the road toward doing some ministry, and wasn't particularly clothed in a lot of humility. I wasn't very winsome about all of my newfound truth, right? and in some cases just wasn't charitable with people who made different life choices about different things and how to apply biblical truth and things like that. Like I would like to go back and tell that guy he needs to simmer down a little bit. But we don't get that. And then the last thing I had was I should have expended more energy on just some of that one-to-one shepherding of people, like just letting people talk and making people feel heard. I had the benefit of that with some people in my life. I could have done a better job of that with other people. And it wasn't until I got a lot older that I have become more purposeful in just listening. Let people talk about what's going on with them. If they want to hear about what's going on with you, they'll ask, but they may be preoccupied with what's going on in their life and they need someone to just listen right now.
Yeah.
And I didn't do that very well as a young guy. So we all can look back with the benefit of hindsight and see things that could have gone better. But I think that's useful sometimes, because sometimes that helps us in moving forward and thinking, what is the 60, 70-year-old me going to look back on me now and go, oh my goodness, what is this guy doing?
I don't think I ever went through when I sort of came into Reformed theology, or I don't even know if that's the right way to put it, but I don't think I ever really went through like a cage stage, even in ministry. So I remember it was the young restless reform stuff. So I grew up in a church that was quasi reformed, and a church that did expository preaching, and that kind of leads to reformed. And when I kind of came back around to that was when the Young Restless Reform stuff came out. So Gospel Coalition, and they used to have their conferences every year. I was in a church in Chicago, west of Chicago, and the country out west of Chicago. And they used to have their conferences every year in Chicago. And I always wanted to go. For some reason, I never did, but I always wanted to go. And I was reading their website regularly, their blog, and then listening to some people. And I remember I actually, the beginning of my being, I wasn't fired from that job, but the beginning of my sort of the separation from that church started when I posted, I think it was on Facebook. This is a long time ago, but Mark Driscoll was sort of one of the leaders of that at the time. He's no good anymore, but he was one of the leaders of that at the time, and he was very influential. And he was on the cover of Time magazine of something like The New Calvinists was the headline or something. And I remember reading it and resonating with the theology behind that. And I posted something about it on Facebook, and one of the, I don't know, meddling women of the church, instead of asking me about it, she just saw the word Calvinist. That's literally all she did. And when I said, I think this is what what I'm working toward, or what I'm becoming, or something like that. And she went straight to the senior pastor. Do you have this guy, this guy on staff that's a Calvinist? And so that was like my first public, like I said, okay, I think this is me. And he came right down to my office and like tried to talk me out of it. And I knew at that point, this is not going to go well. And it didn't go well. And I ended up leaving because it was not going to go well no matter what. And, but I was always conflict averse enough, that I didn't want to make that a big deal. I didn't make it a big deal. They made it a big deal. And so I say all that to say I didn't really go through the same kind of cage stage of like, you got to believe this or you're not going to heaven. I didn't really go through that. I just started teaching through Ephesians in the high school youth group.
Ooh, dangerous.
Yeah.
Uh-oh.
Ephesians is what got me.
Yeah.
Me
Paul,
too.
were you in my high school
Calvinist.
youth group?
I don't think so. So the Chicago area is pretty cool though. So
Yeah.
I was going to make a joke that by the time the Young Restless and Reform movement came around, you were already old and rested. So
I was the leaders of the movement. I'm older than some of them.
Yeah.
I think I'm the same age as Mark Driscoll.
It was incredibly youthful.
He is?
No, I mean, the movement was incredibly youthful.
Well, it was Young, Restless. So it's named after a book that Colin Hansen wrote, who worked, maybe still does, I don't know. He worked for the Gospel Coalition. It was called Young, Restless, and Reformed. And it traced the movement of these Reformed guys that were, they were influenced by John Piper, John MacArthur, Mark Dever, those are and R.C. Sproul. Those are probably the big names, especially Piper and Sproul, and then Tim Keller. And those are sort of the next generation up, our dad's age. Dever's not that old, but those guys are our dad's age. Mm-hmm. And these guys were influenced by him. And so they started what they did is they integrated um, quasi Reformed theology, so some measure of Reformed theology, and the attractional model, and that's what actually attracted me. And that whole thing has kind of disintegrated. It's still kind of out there, but it's gone very woke, and I don't really follow it anymore. I don't really follow those guys anymore. The leaders are great, but the influences, RC and MacArthur and Piper and those guys are fine. But as a movement itself, it's kind of disintegrated. And what's happened is guys have either gone pretty liberal, woke, or they've kind of dug into, like what we've done is dug into the historic confessions of the faith. Mm-hmm. And so I'm grateful for that movement. I think it helped push us, or push me into that theologically. I wish, to go back to our original question, I wish that I had gotten into it on my own when I was younger. I didn't. That would have flavored where I went to school. Had I gone to a different school, it might have helped in those ways. But I wasn't there then. So the Lord used these crooked sticks to bring me and our church to where we are today.
Yeah. All right. So I think an interesting tie-in with this is we think about our younger selves and things that we woulda, coulda, shoulda done, right? Which is can be helpful. I think for those who might be listening to this, who are the Utes, who are trying to do things, you'll have to ask Joe Pesci.
Okay.
Right.
That was pretty good.
Yeah, that was good. I think it would be maybe interesting to give some recommended reading. Now, we've done some book recommendations in the past, and for sure some of these are going to be repeats. But if you had that young man who's trying to be thoughtful, who's trying to equip himself well, and we were talking about this before we started to record. I don't know what your recommendations are. I don't think there's anything on my recommendation list that I would not recommend to young ladies either. So,
well, I think the question came in for young men specifically, right?
Well, that was just my addition question to the, yeah. Okay. So I just thought it tied in nicely with the submitted question.
Yeah.
So if you have that young person in their teens or 20s or something, and they're trying to do things well, and hopefully they avoid some of the mistakes we made and are more balanced about things, but things that we would say, man, you want to do it well, you should read this.
Yeah.
And so let's just we'll just kind of go around it, a book or a couple books, depending on what you have at a time, and just say, you know what, you want to stand on solid ground. This is one you really ought to read. So Lee, why don't you kick us off here? What's one that those young people, they need to be reading?
Yes. Could not recommend higher the book All of Grace by Charles Spurgeon.
I've heard of him.
I've recommended it before. I will continue to recommend it. It was one of the first books I read after kind of realizing that this Calvinism thing was not the boogeyman that I thought it was before. And he, in a very Spurgeon-esque way, brings back all sides of life, matters of doctrine, all of it back to a foundation of grace and peace in Christ. And I think it's a great foundational text for any young Christian. Practically, I would almost call it recommended reading for especially a new Christian to realize and to really drive home the fact that everything that we have in our Christian life is rooted in God's grace toward us. And Spurgeon is one of the best communicators of that, especially among the Baptists. There's a couple Puritans I could mention too, from the baby sprinkling side, and maybe we'll get there. But all of Grace by Charles Spurgeon.
It's a good one. Yeah,
nice. What do you think, Dana? What's your first one?
Well, my first one, the first thing, so I was thinking specifically for young men, but again, the women could read this. But the first one that I recommend is Thoughts for Young Men by J.C. Ryle, and I think women should read it. So this is not specifically, but he wrote this specifically as I think they were lectures that he was giving originally, and I have multiple copies. I'm happy to give out some, but this is just excellent. It's written. So J.C. Ryle was a contemporary of Spurgeon. So late 18, early 1900s, he was a baby sprinkler. He was actually an Anglican, but Reformed, and
A good Anglican.
a good Anglican, and with an epic beard.
His
in
face
later in
argues
life.
well.
That is
Yeah,
epic.
both Ryle and Spurgeon really needed to grow their beards. If you see early pictures, especially Spurgeon, but this is good, and it's timeless. The issues that he deals with, the thoughts that he addresses, are thoughts that we still, and they don't have to be young men. That's what it was originally written for. But we still deal with the things that he's addressing in the book, and so that it's really small. It's really easy to read. You could read it in a couple of settings pretty quickly. But this is one that I think all the guys, I mean, not just guys, but everybody should read this. But especially the young guys, just turning into adults at the church would be great. Thoughts for Young Men, J.C. Ryle, John Charles Ryle.
Nice. So my first submission is two I'm going to put together, and you'll see why. So I have The Attributes of God, A.W. Pink, and None Greater, Matthew Barrett, which is also about the attributes of God. So I just think you can't overestimate the importance, if you're a young person, in understanding who God is, and having some real a robust foundation of who God is, and what God is not. And you'll avoid a lot of wasted time and pitfalls and heading off down a bad path, and then, hopefully realizing, oh man, this is not, I'm headed in the wrong direction here. So a great couple of foundations and getting a good, strong start. I would recommend both of those.
Oh man, you gave me the perfect on ramp to my next.
Okay, there we go.
We did not plan this. I promise.
We don't know what anybody's going to share.
Let's merge, Lee. Merge it right in.
Worlds are colliding. Okay, so Steve just recommended None Greater by Matthew Barrett. Fantastic. You must read it. You must follow the reading of that with the book Simply Trinity, which also follows on very brilliant. There we go. I didn't bring my copy with me, but
there it is, kids.
You have to. You simply have to.
So good. What I
did there?
Yeah.
Professional.
That one's by Barrett too, correct?
Matthew
Barrett. That's also
yes.
Matthew Barrett. Yeah.
It is probably the clearest, most popular, lay Christian focused work on the Trinity I've ever read. It is fantastic. He does a great job explaining the important language that we should use when we discuss the Trinity to avoid the various errors that many make, and then leading ultimately to a path of destruction. And interspersed with these very odd fictional sections that I think he probably should turn into a standalone novel and shouldn't have put them in that book, but it's okay. It's a great book regardless. But seriously, highly recommend it. And I think this is one of those books that this is some very serious and important theology that's worthy of being studied. It's not simply head knowledge. And I think one of the foci of this book, because there's more than one focus, it's to inform about the Trinity, but also to cause the Christian to truly love our Trinitarian God, to be passionate about knowing Him as He is, and then really to then show that love to others, to fellow Christians, and really to know God deeply and to follow Him in the life of the Christian. It does a really good job of not just packing your head full of theological terms and concepts, but really head, heart, hands. Fantastic. Simply Trinity by Matthew Barrett.
Excellent.
Nice.
So of the list so far, he's the only living author we've recommended.
We like the dead
This
guys
is
here.
true. We do like the dead guys.
Yeah.
I recommend so I'll give you another one. Again, this is for anyone. This is John Calvin's Little Book in the Christian Life. This is excellent. Again, it's really simple. It's timeless. I just really recommend what does a Christian life look like is really the answer to or what he's addressing in here. So I would recommend this. It's really simple. What does it mean to live as a Christian? What is self-denial? Bearing the cross, what does that look like? And so there's more, but the Little Book in the Christian Life, I think we went through this in Sunday school in like 2016 or 2017, quite a while ago. And it was really helpful. This was one of the first explicitly reformed books that we went through, taking a big risk and putting Calvin's name on a book, but it was very well received and it was a fun book to go through. Little Book in the Christian Life.
Excellent. I don't have a copy right here in my hand, but one I would definitely recommend for young men is What He Must Be If He Wants to Marry My Daughter by Vodi Bakum.
So good. Yeah.
Actually, I would recommend the young women read it too. It's not, just for clarity, it's not about dating or courtship or planning weddings. It's about manhood. And so what does it actually mean to be a man, right? And how does the Bible look at it, and all the ways that differs from how the world might try to tell you it is defined. And so that is, for me, that would be, required reading for a young man before he's ready to leave mom and dad and leave the house. You should have that one. You should have read that one. That would be a good one.
So is Vodi Bakum, is he the only one that's writing about family life from a Baptist point of view?
I don't know that he is, but I can't think of a different guy. So
he has not only that one, but he's got another one called Family Driven Faith. I've got a couple copies.
Right. I've got that one. I would recommend that one too.
I think Don Whitney wrote a book about family worship.
Okay. But yeah. I guess so that's family worship, but I'm thinking like how to be a man, how to be
family life,
how to run a family.
He's written several. He wrote one called Family Shepherds, which is going to overlap with some of that also, which I would highly recommend. It's really good. They're very readable. Like sometimes you can get in some monstrous texts that are just tough to digest. His books are very easy to read, very, you should be fine with it, but I think it's really useful for
I think that's an area that is a need in churches, like in this year in 2025, or in our modern time, of addressing what should families look like, and spiritually speaking. But even to tie in, we need to prepare our young men to be providers, right? To work hard. Like churches sometimes skip that. We don't think about how do we prepare people? How do we prepare the young guys to get a job and work hard, right? What kind of career is best for you? We don't really address that in churches, and I think that we should. Vocation is an important thing. And then also, like, one of the things that, and I did some sermons on this maybe two years ago, maybe the phrase that kept sticking out in my mind is the high calling of a homemaker. For our young women and wives in the church, like that is not you're not a second class citizen if you are a homemaker. You actually have a great responsibility. And that doesn't necessarily mean you need to not work. The Proverbs 31 woman is very active, and even in some of those activities makes money, buys a field and sells it, whatever. So I think that from a Baptistic as opposed to a Credo, as opposed to a Paedo-Baptist, Presbyterian or whatever point of view, but from a Baptistic point of view, I think there's a great need there for training new husbands, new wives, or future husbands, future wives, and how to raise children too. And I think Bodhi is probably the only one that's doing that I know of. There may be other stuff out there. He's probably the most well-known, I should say, doing work in that area, that has published books in that area, and has, like, you can look him up online and listen to conference talks and stuff like that too, where he's addressing some of those things. I think that's important.
He's helpful in that. One of his favorite phrases is something along the lines of "you've been lied to," and in particular when you're talking about like biblical manhood and biblical womanhood, and don't take for granted because, well, I grew up going to church. You might be surprised that how much you bought into the lie.
Right.
And he does a good job of providing some clarity there where you may go, oh, I do think of manhood as this, and this, and we ain't getting that from the Bible, So I would just add it to your list of must reads. Those are all, good stuff. All right, Lee, I think it's your turn. We're back around to you, buddy.
Another one. Well, on to prayer this time. I think a really nice and helpful book, and that is easy to get. I think you can get it in a free ebook download on Monergism, which has so many good books on it. But it's a Guide to Fervent Prayer by A.W. Pink. It's a great book. He takes prayers prayed in the pages of Scripture, so prayers from the Old Testament, prayers from the New Testament, and extracts from those texts important principles for how we as Christians should pray, the kinds of prayers we should pray, how to intercede, how to thank God, all these kind of factors of prayer that are essential, and that we might be struggling in one or more of them, or just in the habit of praying on its own. Lots of really good and helpful encouragements there from Scripture. I could not recommend it higher. A Guide to Fervent Prayer by A.W. Pink. Real men read Pink.
Nice.
Connected to that, this reminded me, a similar style book is A Call to Spiritual Reformation by D.A. Carson. So it's Priorities from Paul and His Prayers. And this is
Another
excellent
living
too.
author.
What's that?
Another living author.
Yeah.
It's our third one so far, I think.
Yeah.
For now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He's got to be getting up there.
We're all living for now.
So go with the Pink book to begin with. But Don Carson looks at Paul's prayers specifically, and we went through this in Sunday school too several years ago, or at least we used the concepts of pulling out Paul's prayers, and it was really helpful for me. But yeah, so a couple of books on prayer. That was a last minute addition.
I'm going to throw one that's a little different from what some of the other stuff we've recommended so far. The Screw Tape Letters.
Oh yeah.
For a young man, I think it's a big deal to recognize and be reminded that not everything invisible is good, and that the story of human history is about war. And we could take that truth and become a real obnoxious jerk about it, but we could also sleepwalk through this thing and not be in a appropriate state of war. And I think it's fictional, unlike the other books we've been talking about, but it's a good, hopefully, little wake-up call that there's more than just what you see, and stuff is happening, and you should be vigilant. And it's entertaining. It's, again, very easy read. If you're not a Olympic reader, this one you'll be fine.
Yep.
But worth the time to read that one. All right, one more. You got one more in you, everybody?
I certainly have one more.
Okay.
And this is technically one book. I'm glad you opened the floodgates to fiction, because I had this on the list.
Here we go.
I had this on the list. Hopefully, my background has not given it away already.
It's the Agatha
But-
Christie mysteries, isn't it?
Yeah, it's And Then There Were None by Agatha
Yeah.
Christie. I would recommend that you read The Lord of the Rings. It is one book. It's not a trilogy. It's a trilogy of movies. It is one book in 3 volumes, essentially. And so the reason I would recommend it to young Christians, number one, it's an incredible work of fantasy that really is based on Christian principles. Even though J.R.R. Tolkien was a papist, he's no longer a papist, and the books are good. So, but what they really do is they present a world. We live in a world that has all of these shades of gray all over it, and people are willing to paper over the black and white true evil in the world. And they want to, like anything that you watch or read anymore, the hero is at best an anti-hero who's like a very morally conflicted individual who does a good thing sometimes, but also does bad things. But ultimately, it all shakes out for good in the end, and that's our hero. Tolkien was allergic to anything like that. And so one of the things I love most, and I think is most helpful for Christians in reading this, number one, it's just a great story, and we need to have great stories. We are creatures of story. But the fact that the story is, like I said, not only built on Christian principles, but this is a world where there are truly honorable men, honorable kings, who speak wisely and act wisely. And there is completely conflict-free forces of evil, and ultimately the forces of good triumph over evil in very plain and glorious ways. And so we can kind of be, kind of up and down about, oh, the bad is winning. There's all of these, things going on in the world that are terrible. And sometimes it takes a story like Lord of the Rings to remind us, in a way, everything's going to be okay. We know the outcome of the true story of history in Scripture, but sometimes we feel it when it's repackaged, recreated in a world that's not like ours. Sometimes we can understand things going on in our world better when it's cast in a different world, and I think Lord of the Rings does a really good job of that. It's a ripping good yarn, and I think it's beneficial.
The clarity is refreshing.
It is
for someone in 2025 with all the muddy water in the world. Let's put it that way. Yeah.
I've got a couple. One is a genre. I'm going to recommend you read biographies. I think looking at, it doesn't even matter. I mean, it matters which ones, but read biographies, read them, bunches of from different walks of life, different time frames. In ministry, I like to read about pastors and theologians. So there's a good one about Bavinck. His is good. There's the two that I pulled out that have probably think about the most is Ian Murray's biography of Martin Lloyd-Jones, the doctor. And there's 2 of them. There's a double volume and then the shorter one. I think this is the shorter one. It's excellent. And the Dr. Martin Lloyd-Jones was used in incredible ways and continues to be in England. And so that's one of my favorites. And then one that I read, I think I read this last summer, Prepared to Stand Alone, J.C. Ryle, again by Ian Murray. And if you read anything by Ian Murray, it's great. He's the guy that started Banner of Truth Trust. He's still alive. But both of these biographies are just tremendous. And there's a ton of biographies on Banner of Truth's website. And they don't even have to be Christian biographies. Just be careful, but read about what people have done. There's some, read about Winston Churchill and whoever. And then the other one, and this is going back to the original question, what is something that you would tell yourself from early ministry or something that would have helped you? I really wish that I knew this better. The confession, 1689 Baptist Confession of Faith. I wish that I had found this earlier, or embraced it earlier, studied it earlier, and sort of made it a way that I think to help me think through the topics that are addressed in it. What we believe, a confession is, here's what we believe about this, this, and this, and I wish that I had known that earlier. This one that I keep this next to my desk, and it's all marked up and it's kind of falling apart. It's in modern English, which is really helpful, and it's put out by Founders Ministries, and their stuff has been really good. And so I wish that I had that sort of as a foundation earlier on. One of the things I think, especially as I get older or more into the ministry, my education, none of the three of us went to seminary, and so we were all essentially self-taught or taught by one another, right? And taught by reading and listening to sermons. And we live in a time when there's all kinds of stuff online, and I would just recommend people to get in there and study on your own as well. And we can help with resources for that. Ligonier has incredible stuff. And I mean, I just would recommend Ligonier. And then there's, Banner of Truth for books and stuff. If I was doing it over, or if I was 30 and going into ministry now, I would go to some place like Covenant Baptist Theological Seminary, which is seminaries are changing how they do it. When I graduated from my undergrad, so I went to school when I was 20. I started when I was 29, and we already had kids. Graduated when I was 32, and to think about going then to seminary for 3 more years was out of the question. And I had a decent foundation in my undergrad, but then I took that and I built on it essentially myself to become self-taught. And I think it's good and appropriate. If I was doing it over, I would go to something like Covenant Baptist, which you can do online. Back then there was very few that were doing anything online. You had to go live there, and then your wife had to work while you went to school. And now the models are all changed, and it's much different. And I don't think you have to go to seminary. I don't think to be a pastor, or an elder. I don't think you have to do any of that, but that's what I would have done. If I had that opportunity now. I went through some difficult times in the early years of ministry. That my first 2 ministry posts were really difficult, and I think one of the things. So as we talk about all of this, as we talk about books that we would have read or that we recommend young guys read, I think when I was first in ministry, I was not a man of humility. I don't know that I'm still a man of humility, but I'm not as bad as I used to be. and I wish, that's one thing, an area that I needed to grow in. And frankly, that's not something that you can just buckle down and be, right? Like you actually have to go through, you have to be humbled. And so I had to be humbled more than once, and go through some of those difficult things and say, man, I wish this, I wish that, I wished I'd done this, I wished I'd read that, or but God used all of that to get us to where we are. And you think about men like Moses, who was an old man when he started to lead the nation. He had it all, and then he gave it all up, and he went and lived in the wilderness and took care of his father-in-law's sheep until he was like 80 years old. And the Lord said, okay, now bring my people out here. And look at, but he used young men too. He used David as a young man, Daniel as a young man. So the disciples, I'm actually convinced, we won't get into this now, I'm convinced that except for Peter, all of the disciples were under 20 when they were with Jesus. And God used them mightily, like in their early 20s, right? When Christ ascended to heaven. I think Peter was older, but I think the other men were younger. And he used them in an incredible way. So we are what we are, and the Lord has used us to get us to where we are, and is going to continue to use us. And I praise God for that. But we also have some good resources, and we can pass on some of that wisdom to the Utes, as they say, as the old people say, because it's like a movie.
Yeah, the young people don't know what we're talking about. Like, what? What did he call me? All right, I guess this is probably our last one. Here's my last one. Yeah. The Sovereignty of God by some guy named Arthur W. Pink.
Wow.
Perhaps you've heard of him. Yeah. Another really good one, good foundation stone, theological book to read if you're looking for more to add to your list. So yeah. Any final thoughts there, Lee? You got any parting shots for anybody?
Dana was just talking about, wanting to have been more read into the confession earlier. And so I would just put a shameless little plug. If you would like to study the confession with some of your friends, we study it a chapter at a time on Thursday nights at RBC at 7:00. So if you want to come and discuss and read and think about God deeply, then come on over.
Do it.
Nice.
We sometimes have cookies, but not all the time.
Excellent. I think we're ready for a blessing.
Let's bless it up. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace.
Amen.
Amen.